Mississippi. In certain respects, that song draws me back to a bit of a simpler life, back when I was a little kid, draws me back to my roots, reminds me of my beginnings as a poor little Mississippi queer boy, and it offers a sense of location and a sense of rootedness. Now, I was asked by Jody to assure you that this has become home for me. That really is not home. Right, Jody? Where's Jody? Oh, well done. Good, good. Yeah, to just make sure I tell you folks, really, in a way, this has really become home for me in many, many ways, living in Phoenix. So as I think about that song, I think about the quintessential country road, and I think about aloneness, I think about solitude, I think about the road trip following unknown pavement or gravel. I also think back to the song Me and You and a Dog Named Boo. And I think about Jackson and I finding roads that are untraveled. And I've been asked, though, in the course, as I'm considering interviewing folks back in Mississippi around the civil rights movement and how it informs movements today for justice and equity, am I not scared to travel alone with my dog across states like Texas or Alabama or Mississippi or the Deep South to drive some of those back roads? And you have all of those social justice stickers plastered all over your pickup, right? And some people have said, you're going to take some of those off, right? After all, I have nothing to fear because I have my trusty guard dog with me. Doesn't he look ferocious? So, we as Americans are really travelers, especially here in Phoenix. We love our automobiles, right? We love our cars. We go everywhere in cars, if at all possible. Each summer as a child that I remember back in Mississippi, we'd take a road trip, and we usually tented. We all had tents with all the aunts and the uncles and all the kin back in Mississippi, and we'd usually land at one state park and spend about 5 days there together. This one particular story I'm going to share is a state park that's in Mississippi, and it is called Tishomingo State Park. I was about 9 years old, and it was a time for the 30-plus Pennington cousins to go crazy, right, in the state park. Well, this particular time, I didn't realize that actually this particular state park, Tishomingo, is rich in Native American history, and I have since learned that it was believed that it was inhabited by Paleo Indians as early as 7000 BC. The Natchez Parkway runs through this park, which is an incredibly beautiful drive that you need to do in Mississippi if you're ever there. But it's also home to these incredibly huge rock formations and plants that are found nowhere else in the state of Mississippi. So you take a walk through this park, and having the opportunity to play in this park most summers, because it was also pretty close to Boonville, was quite exciting. But one night, my 30 Pennington cousins, we walked down to the railroad tracks that were adjacent to the park, and we got the harebrained idea that we would gather up lots of railroad spikes and paint them gold and sell them as the Golden Spike. We were young entrepreneurs. So the Golden Spike, connected, right, the two east and the west railroad lines. So to make a long story short, we did pull up about 80 spikes and hid them in the campground, in tents, in trunks of cars, everywhere we could around the camp, because we were going to make a killing with these spikes, right, so to speak. That night, though, there was a grain train that derailed right on that spot. So that's still just between you and me. Nobody was hurt, nobody was injured in the accident, but that's what happened. So why do I tell that story? I'm not exactly sure. Except that I love this book of Joshua. And the book of Joshua, in many ways, as is Exodus, Genesis, and Joshua, and all of these Older Testament books, they're kind of train wrecks. The individuals in these books are train wrecks, and yet they're used in mighty ways by God. And I love the story of Joshua because it reminds me of a novella, right, or a good Harlequin novel. It's sex and murder and intrigue and war and love and all the good and complicated stuff that life is made of. Today, though, this is where our story picks up. After 40 years of wandering in the desert, 2 weeks ago I talked about that. They had been wandering in the desert for 40 years. They had crossed the Red Sea. Now they were in the middle of the desert, and they literally were crossing their path over and over and again, and it was only about a 50-mile radius. They were preparing now to enter the promised land. They were about ready to cross another river. So for those 40 years of wandering, they shook off almost 400 years of enslavement and oppression and bondage. During those 40 years, they were finding their voice. They were finding their God once again. They were connecting with each other in this newfound freedom. And it was a new generation of Hebrew people that were going to step into the promised land, because many who began the journey crossing the Red Sea did not cross the Jordan because they died in the desert. Moses, the leader that brought them across the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, was dead, and they had a new leader, Joshua. And so Joshua is standing on the shore of the Jordan River, and he prays. He prays. He asks for guidance. He asks for strength to go on leading these incredibly tired and worn-out people who have been camping for 40 years in the desert. And Joshua first then says, consecrate yourselves. Take a bath. Scrub hard. Get all that desert grime off. Scrub your clothes. He says, refrain from sex. Get ready to cross over. Release the past. Let go. It is time to move forward. So after a day of cleansing in the Jordan spa, Joshua assembles the people. They line up behind the Ark of the Covenant. The priests carry the ark into the middle of the river, which was swollen and treacherous, overflowing its banks with snowmelt from probably Mount Hermon. Maybe it was their monsoon season. And as soon as the priests wade into the river with the ark, the water stops flowing. And it piles up in a heap 20 miles north. I guess that's a pretty big dam. The priests stand with the ark in the middle of the riverbed, and the entire nation of Israelites and Hebrew people, they cross on dry land. And then Yahweh commands Joshua to have 12 men, one from each of the 12 tribes, pick up stones at the center of the riverbed. So once everybody gets across and everybody is safe on the other side of the shore, the river rushes back in, just kind of like it did at the beginning of their 40-year journey. It's a miracle. Joshua takes the 12 stones they'd brought and stacks them into a memorial. And that memorial stood there as a sign to all nations of the earth that Yahweh, their God, had parted the waters once again, the waters of Jordan, just as God had parted the Red Sea or the Reed Sea. The Hebrew people were saved by a mighty, powerful God. Don't mess with us. And even now, thousands of years later, stones remain as an aid to individual and collective memory. If you go up to Sedona, you see these cairns everywhere, right? Along the path and along the journey, to mark our journeys. Now, on the other side of the Jordan River is where things get a bit messy, I would say, because now it's time to do what? Oh, conquer the land. It's time to declare war. It's time for the Battle of Jericho. Can anybody sing that? Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, Jericho. You got it. So they marched around the city with the Ark of the Covenant for 6 days, and on the 7th day they marched around the city 7 times, gave a long blast with the ram's horn, and the city walls collapsed. And the Israelite army captured the city, exterminated all the inhabitants of the city, plus their livestock. Wow. So what are you going to do with that, James, huh? How are you going to make that into something relevant and positive? This nation, which had been altered for 40 years and reconnected with their God, now brings great oppression on the people in Jericho and Canaan. They secured a homeland, and they won. As the crossing of the Red Sea washed away the identity of the original nation of Israel as an oppressed people, Jordan's waters washed away their identity as homeless wanderers and kind of gave them a bit of a new identity as conquerors. No longer campers in the desert, but conquerors. And they establish their nation. So detour time, as I always do in the middle of a message. This is really quite a bloody story. Was this really what Yahweh wanted? Is this what God wanted? Or is this just what the people recorded in the book? I would like to go back and potentially rewrite the story, but we can't. Or maybe I'd like to collectively rethink the story. The Israelites carry the ark, which is the very presence of God, into the battle, driving out the indigenous peoples from their homeland. This is a story that's been repeated over and over and over and over again from every nation and every religion. No nation is really exempt. Why? Because of resources. This, after all, was their promised land and their land of milk and honey. A promised land. This is a glorified history of Israel becoming conquerors, decimating peoples and cultures. It is in these kind of ancient narratives where early American foremothers and forefathers have found permission to do the very same to this American promised land. Those in power in the Americas have advanced the imperialistic history that God guided the European powers to a new promised land, the Americas, that many called the land of milk and honey. We can find all sorts of stories within this book, narratives giving us permission to drive out indigenous peoples, to take whatever we want to take, to steal land, and then not to admit that we're standing on stolen land. John Stewart, who I think is somewhat of a prophetic voice in our time, has said, "The danger of oppression is not just being oppressed, it's becoming an oppressor." The Hebrews here who had experienced 500 years of oppression, who oppress now the Canaanites by seizing Jericho, their city and their land. So in the midst of our detour, how do we as peace-loving, justice-making, progressive people of faith respond to stories like this? Maybe you should tell me. Lila Watson, an Australian Indigenous activist, said this. She said, "If you've come to help me, you are wasting your time, but if you have come because your liberation is tied up with mine, hey, then let's work together." My friends in the journey, it is time to work together, to even cross the aisles and the lines and work together. Because your liberation is tied up with my liberation, and my liberation is tied up with your liberation. And until you are free, I am not free. And if I am not free, you are not free. Back to the story. Here are some of the lessons learned, for me at least, in this story. You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. This narrative teaches us we cannot change the past, but we can start new over and over and over and over again. We can change the future narrative, we can change our current narrative, and we can work together to be the change that we want to see in our world. Thank you, Gandhi. This story of slavery and oppression to liberation and freedom, from homelessness to having a homeland, this was the Israelites' story. And this is how they chose to write the story. And in the middle of the story, although they repeated unhealthy, oppressive behaviors, they also needed to find places of healing on the journey, to find a new way forward and find a new way to be. And I personally think that's part of the reason Jesus enters the scene, to show the Jewish people and the Hebrew people, and really the religious leaders, that they need to take a detour and do life differently. Almost all the people of Israel who had witnessed the crossing of the Reed Sea and their escape from oppression had died. The illustration of parting of the Jordan River reinforced Yahweh's love for this new generation of Israelites. And now crossing into the promised land, the land of milk and honey with all these great resources, was representing a break with Israel's past. It was a new day. They were new people. They were released from their old patterns of oppression into the new light of spiritual freedom. At least that is the narrative that I would like to put around this old story. Sometimes the old must die to allow the new to spring forth. We all know this is true, right? That's the human experience. It's the nature of the divine experience. It's the nature of the human experience. So, second point of learning for myself and hopefully for you, there are always new crossings. There's always new crossings. There's new opportunities to step from one side onto the other side. There's rivers and streams and cricks to cross. Crick. There's new journeys to be had. There's opportunities to step over the line and be in a new place and a new space. Always being challenged to embrace a new direction on the journey of life. Because we know that life is so full of obstacles, right? Obstacles that sometimes we climb over and sometimes obstacles that need to be removed completely. There are rivers to be crossed. There are boundaries to be challenged. Oh, sadly enough, there are not fences or walls to be built, but fences and walls to be torn down. Often we need to do the work of crossing, though, together, reaching out with an oar or with a hand or with our heart. Shonda Rhimes said this: "You can waste your lives drawing lines, or you can live your life crossing them." Here's the final lesson, at least for me, that I've learned from this story. And I had about 20 others, but I had to cut them out. I once asked my friend Rabbi Shmuley, that you probably know if you've been around the community for a bit, why the Jewish people have been so hated, so abused throughout history, and why anti-Semitism is resurfacing in some really incredible ways in 2019. And he said this to me. He said, "James, I really don't know. I thought rabbis knew everything. I thought it was just us Christian clergy who didn't know anything. But God told us to be strong and courageous, and we have been that." You just open the Old Testament, you study the history of our Jewish brothers and sisters through the Holocaust, and today, resilience is their middle name. Courage is their middle name. Strength is their middle name. In this narrative of Joshua, God is forever telling Joshua and Joshua's people, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. In fact, in the first chapter, God tells Joshua and the people 7 times, because that's the number of perfection, to be strong and be courageous. Be brave, be bold. Be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So turn to the person next to you and tell them that God is with me wherever I go, and tell them God is with you wherever you go. Take just a minute. So people have asked, going back to my beginning theses, isn't it dangerous there in Mississippi for you, an openly gay man with crazy bumper stickers all over your truck? And James, you have said you aren't the best driver. You can see a few dents and scrapes in my truck. And getting behind the wheel of a car is like a sedative for me. That's what I need to do at night when I can't sleep. But honestly, as I look at this book of Joshua, and as I look at my whole journey in my entire life from beginning to end, it's really about leaving my times and even leaving my driving in God's hands. foolishly or courageously, I hear these words each and every day of my life, and I want you to hear those words each and every day of your life. Be strong and be courageous. Sometimes we are strong and courageous. Sometimes we're willing to cross some pretty wild rivers. Periodically, we're willing to spend 40 years wandering in a hot desert. Sometimes we're willing to travel light, as I said last week, and sometimes we're willing just to take the walking stick and the sandals and the clothes on our back and put ourselves in harm's way. Sometimes we decide to do the right thing, the just thing, even if it means it isn't going to be easy and we may put ourselves in risk for ridicule and abuse. So why drive 1,400 miles one way to do a little bit more personal communal work around the civil rights movement, around racism and white privilege, and be able to bring that back to my beloved community, to be changed myself, and to cross a number of rivers, cross a number of creeks, to inform how do we get to full inclusion and equity in God's world and God's kingdom today. One more contemporary spokesperson, Bob Marley, said, "You never know how strong you are until being strong is the only choice you have." Ain't that the truth? So this is the picture of the back of one of my UCC preacher friends in Minneapolis, who will remain nameless for anonymity. But she wears this on her back because it reminds her to be strong and courageous, to stand with her back to the powers that be, those things that seek to take our courage and our strength and our equity and our justice away from us. So let us be strong and let us be courageous in this journey of life. Be strong and courageous with Pastor Susan over the next 7 weeks as she wrangles this community on her own. She won't be alone because she's strong and courageous. And I want to end with this quote from a Muslim writer and professor. I recently read her book, and her book is entitled Reclaim Your Heart, Personal Insights on Breaking Free from Life's Shackles. And this is what she says. Resilience, and I would say courage, is very different than being numb. Resilience and courage means you experience, you feel, you fail, you hurt, you fall. And read that together with me. But you keep going. May God give us the resilience. May God give us the courage, the strength for the journey ahead. That's what we need right now. I think that's who we need to be right now. To cross the rivers, to cross the streams, to cross whatever sea it is, to get to that other side, to promote love and justice and kindness and goodness and equity in our world. No matter